A very good morning to you. Welcome to the West Ham Voice on a Thursday morning. How the weeks are flying by. Only 2 days to go now before the first Premier League game of the season. And I've got to be honest, I'm looking forward to it. Look, the main theme of this video this morning is all about the squad. And about the unfinished business that seems to be going on in the transfer window, and what Tim Steidten is doing in dismantling the squad that David Moyes built. But before I do that, I think there's some important things that I really like to bring to your attention. And the first is all about concession tickets. Now, there's been a concerted effort across the whole fan base to try and get West Ham United to change its mind on dropping concession tickets for under 21s and for OAPs. And there's been a bit of a breakthrough. It seems the club have come to an agreement to start offering concession tickets again. There's a bit of a caveat at the moment. From what I understand at this moment in time, concession tickets for games that are classified A, AA, like the big games against Man City and Chelsea, etc. Concessions will only be available for bands 5 and 6 in the stadium. But when it comes to concessions for other games like Category B, Category C games, then there'll be concession ticket prices available across all bandings, not just for bands 5 and 6. So that's a breakthrough. It's a really good breakthrough, but it's not the end, because Paul Colburn contacted me yesterday. If you remember, he was on about a week or so ago talking about the whole issue with concession tickets at Hammers United. And he said, look, the cause continues so that concessions get back to where they were, not just for match day tickets, but also for season ticket holders as well. So there's still a battle going on, but it's great that West Ham United have actually come to a compromise that we can build on now and hopefully move on from there. Of course, the next thing is, I'm sure you've already heard that we've drawn Bournemouth at home in the second round of the Carabao Cup. And the game will be played in the week commencing the 26th of August. Now, I dare say it's likely to be on either on the Tuesday night or the Wednesday night, 27th or 28th. It's sandwiched in between our away game to Crystal Palace on the Saturday and then our home game to Manchester City the following weekend. Tickets and further details will be made available, probably, if not today, certainly later on in this week, as to when tickets and pricing will become available. And one other thing before we go into the whole squad issue, it kind of links, I guess, is that we've got it all wrong regarding Crescencio Somerville. Now, he's been included as part of the homegrown tally in the senior squad, which means that we now have 9 homegrown players in the 25-man squad. Now, this is significant because it means that whilst we're looking at players potentially leaving the club, we will still have 8 homegrown players if the likes of, say, Danny Ings or Mikel Antonio or even James Ward-Prowse leaves the club this transfer window. So it's quite interesting. Now, if you're new to the channel, please do hit the like button. Please do become a subscriber of the channel. Costs you nothing to subscribe, and the content is always free. My apologies for repeating myself if you've heard it before, but if you're new to the channel and you like the content, please do become a subscriber. So let's talk about the squad itself. Now, in addition to the info that I've just given you, the main news this week is all about Tim Steidten and Lopetegui deciding who to keep and who to let go of in the current squad. Now, unsurprisingly, news like players like Maxwell, Kurt Zuma, potentially Naifa Gerd, Mikel Antonio, Danny Ings, and Thomas Soek have all been linked. There's stories about them being linked with moves away from the club this week. One thing is certain in football: there's no room for sentiment. Now, whilst there's plenty of room at times for loyalty, sentiment doesn't always get you a team that will win things and will win games and will win trophies. Mind you, even loyalty sometimes doesn't get you that either. And we can see clearly that sentiment and non-loyalty for that matter is not playing any part in Tim Steidten's slow dismantling of the squad that David Moyes has built. Now, we all knew that the squad needed a major overhaul, but I think many of us, if not almost all of us, are surprised at just how much of an overhaul there has been so far, with signs that our transfer business is not done just yet. We could look at the squad that Moyes left behind, and we all knew more or less where changes and improvements needed to be made. There have been many players whose playing days at West Ham should have ended some time ago. In fact, some may argue that we still have players in the current squad who should never really have been brought to West Ham in the first place. But the sentiment and loyalty that Moyes afforded these players has ultimately contributed to the overhaul inevitability. Our transfer window to date has been about bringing players who are essential additions to help strengthen the squad. Lopetegui has given players an opportunity to demonstrate their worth in pre-season, and he's now seen enough to know what more he needs to do in the transfer market. Steidten has been given his instructions as to where to improve the squad, and he made the appropriate moves in the transfer window so far to ensure that we've now got a squad that has depth and that will be competing on all fronts in all competitions this coming season. Just about every player that's been brought in so far in this window is a step up from the players that we've had before. We had needed, as we know, an out-and-out striker for a number of years. And now we have one who is competing with, let's be honest, is a makeshift striker in Antonio and a striker in Danny Ings, who, let's be honest again, has seen better days by the time he arrived at West Ham. And with the likes of Nicholas Fulkrug coming in, he's a classic number 9 who could prove to be one of the most astute signings of this summer window. And he will give us now that depth up front that we've needed for quite some time. We've also needed depth on the left side of attacking midfield. Instead of continuing with experimenting with players like Paqueta, who's played there, or in the past Pablo Fornals, Ben Rama, etc., some to varying levels of success, but mostly to varying levels of failure. Crescencio Somerville will finally offer us that balance on the left side of attacking midfield that we've been crying out for. And then when it comes to central midfield, no longer are we going to see the same players being used week in, week out, without any squad rotation, without any way of being able to change things either before or during a game when it's desperately been needed. Now, although I still believe that they will have a role to play, we're unlikely to see as much of Thomas Soek or James Ward-Prowse in the starting lineup this season. Plus, it feels like a distant memory now that many of us, including myself, were advocating that perhaps Flynn Downes should have been given a chance this season. With the arrival of World Cup winner Guido Rodriguez, let's go one back, with the arrival of World Cup winner Guido Rodriguez, the midfield has been transformed in one fell swoop. We're likely to see a very different midfield setup where Lopetegui will have a number of options available to him to change the midfield that best fits the teams that we're playing against. I dare say at times we will see a midfield pivot of Rodriguez and Alvarez that I discussed in a previous show, where the two will create that midfield wall, so to speak, to protect our defence and to allow our attacking players to do what they do best, and that's attack. And at other times, I dare say we're likely to see the likes of Paqueta alongside, I don't know, Rodriguez or Alvarez or whatever. Paqueta dropping deeper, which will allow Kudus to play a more central role rather than potentially on the left, which means that you bring Somerville in on that left side. So the options in signing both Rodriguez and Somerville are quite endless in our midfield setup. Then in defence, Now we have, on paper at least, a much younger, fitter set of defenders who are going to be stronger in the challenge and can carry the ball out from defence to initiate attacks. Lopetegui now has the defensive defenders available to him where we can play a much higher press, and we will have players who have the ability and the skill in the likes of Wan-Bissaka and Todibo, who have the stamina, pace, agility to recover in a high-line situation if we lose possession of the ball. And talking of Wan-Bissaka, we have to admit that he is a defensive upgrade on Ben Johnson and Vladimir Coufal. And whilst Bissaka may not create as many goal-scoring opportunities as Coufal has gotten accustomed to, we have been crying out for a much stronger backline. So I'm fine with him doing the job that he's been brought in to do, and that is to defend. The likes of Todibo and Kilman, of course, are upgrades on the likes of Zuma and the much beloved Ogbonna. And at the same time, our two new centre-backs are more likely to be more stable and less error-prone than Mavropanos and Agurd. And then even in goal, bringing in Wes Foderingham with his experience, it immediately intensifies the competition for goalie places that we may not have had last season with the likes of Joseph Enang in the squad. Foderingham will push Fabianski, who will push Areola, which can only bode well in that department as well. But back to what about other senior players who have maybe haven't quite hit the mark just yet, or maybe there are question marks over their future at West Ham? The next phase of this transfer window is now the fine-tuning of the squad. I've just mentioned about all the essential players that we brought in, but now the fine-tuning is where players who may not be part of Lopetegui's plans or are going to be readied to be moved on so that targets in the transfer market can be brought in to replace them. Now, we keep hearing that there's potentially another 2 transfers to be done. However, I've got a list of at least 6 players who I believe could potentially still leave West Ham United in this summer transfer window. Now, the names are not likely to surprise you in any way, but you may also have other players that you believe need to be added to this list. I'll leave you to let me know in the comments. I've been told that we're at the stage now where if we lose a player, 1 player will come in. So 1 in, 1 out. The prospect of conducting, at the very least, 2 additional transfers seems quite likely. But like I said, there could be even more than that. Now, the first story that came up this week is about Thomas Soucek. Now, he may well be reconsidering his future at the club if it materialises that he might end up being a backup player rather than a regular starter for West Ham. I talked about loyalty and sentiment a moment ago, and many would argue that Soucek got a massive dose of both of them under David Moyes, which may not necessarily be afforded to him under Lopetegui. Should we end up buying, for example, Carlos Soler from PSG that we've been rumoured to be looking at, I think we can then kiss goodbye Thomas Soucek from West Ham United. Then there's the inevitable of saga of Kurt Zuma. After hearing that there were complications with his medical at Dubai club Shabab Al Ahly, there's not been much else to report on. It's all a bit fuzzy as to what's happening next. Some rumours, as I've mentioned the other day, are suggesting that he's still out there negotiating terms, and some are saying that it's completely collapsed and he's back in London. Either way, Kurt Zuma is not going to be part of the senior squad next season. And as I suggested a few weeks ago, if he cannot find a new club to go to, then there's a good chance that West Ham United are going to look at a severance package to let the player go. Now, Zuma's replacement has already been brought into the club with the recent signing of Jean-Claire Todibo. However, Lopetegui will be keen to free up another place in the squad so that he can bring in a player who may not necessarily be an out-and-out centre-back, But in a player like, for example, Trevor Chalobah, someone who can play the role if needed. Now, to be honest, Chalobah would be more likely to be a replacement for the likes of Doros Mavropanos, rather than, as I've said, we've already got a replacement for Zuma, we've already got a replacement for Ogbonna and Kilman. So if we do bring Chalobah in, it could be that we will see Doros Mavropanos leave the club. It's been rumoured that he's been made available for around £13 million. Now, what would be good about the signing of Chalobah is that he can also play as a right back, which could be a decent cover for Aaron Wan-Bissaka. But again, that is all dependent on what happens with Vladimir Coufal, who, with 1 year remaining on his contract, may well decide, a bit like Thomas Soucek, that maybe his future lies elsewhere. It's going to be interesting to see how that develops over time. There's no plans to let go of Vladimir Coufal, but I think if an offer comes in, and with the likes of Chalobah being potentially available, then that something may happen. And there's also Sergi Roberto, the Barcelona player who's just left, who's on a free agent now. And despite his age at 32, there's quite a lot of clamour for him from a number of clubs around Europe, in Premier League as well, one of them being Spurs. Now, to be honest, I think if we do actually get Chalobah, I don't think we will then go for Roberto as well, despite him being available on a free transfer. We're still waiting for news of bids for Naya Gerd. Apparently, Tim Steidten is working on finding a suitor for the Moroccan international. Perhaps this is why we're now being linked to Nathan Zezi of Nantes. The 19-year-old centre-back has only made his senior debut last season, and he's only made 16 appearances in total. But after being promoted from the academy squad at Nantes, he's made a name for himself. Now, apparently, we've made an offer of 20 million euros. Nantes want 30 million. Of course they do. When Tim Steidten pearl dives for young up-and-coming players, I'm just not so certain his desire is to continue spending vast sums of money on these players in the way he did with Luis Guilherme from Palmeiras, which is why I'm not so sure that Zeze may be a target. It could well be, but I don't think we're going to want to spend much more than 20 million euros on that player. The club would also welcome bids for Maxwell Cornet, who's still got several years left on his contract. But despite not really shining in pre-season, being a versatile player does maybe still give him a role to play in the squad. I don't know. I'm not so sure. Again, it's a bit like Zuma. Moving this player on would free up a valuable place in the squad. And there is, of course, continued talk that we are interested in Carlos Soler from PSG. Now, if Soler came in, okay, he's not like for like for Cornet, but like I said, Cornet going would free up a place in the squad to bring in someone like Soler. Now, apparently, we're also interested in Youssouf Fofana from Monaco. Look, I would love for Fofana to come in, but you're not going to get Soler and Fofana. Well, you may do, but I don't think it's highly likely. Soler would be available for about £17 million, and Fofana apparently now is only available for about £21-22 million. Now, we know that there are interest in both players. Real Sociedad are apparently interested in Soler, and AC Milan want Fofana to go to Italy. Could Tim Steidten do the same and snatch another French player from the jaws of an Italian club like he did with Todibo? I mean, it would be superb, really, wouldn't it, if that happens? And then finally, up front, continued talk about players coming and going in the striker area. Both Danny Ings and Mikel Antonio are in the final years of their contracts. Slight difference. Antonio, there's an option to extend it for another year, but I don't know whether that will happen. They're both big earners at the club, and both players, with the greatest of respect to both of them, are on a decline. Maybe Ings more so than Antonio at this stage. But at 32 and 34 years old, respectively, neither player is the future of the club. And there isn't an opportunity. If there is an opportunity to move one or both of them on, I think West Ham United would do that. But where would the likes of Antonio or Ings go? With Ings, we heard earlier in the transfer window that there was interest in his old club, Southampton, but he turned that offer down. Now, if we were to actually get another striker before we looked at selling Ings, that might trigger him going a little bit like Soucek's thinking, a little bit like maybe Vladimir Coufal is thinking, that maybe another striker coming in is the end of his time at West Ham, and then that might help him to decide to move on. And as for Antonio, the rumour apparently of there being interest by Wolves doesn't quite ring true for me. And the reason being is this. I've said for quite some time that Antonio would ideally look for another big payoff before his career ends. He's got a year left on his contract at West Ham. He's now one of the highest earners on about 100 grand a week. And with the difficulties, financial difficulties that we've heard Wolves having, I can't see them matching that sort of salary, or in fact increasing it, to be quite honest with you. So that's why I'm not so sure that Mikel Antonio, if he was to leave West Ham, would go to Wolves. Now, we keep hearing about John Duran. And from what I understand now is that he's been given, or he's going to be given, the number 9 shirt at Aston Villa, which maybe is a statement from the club that they don't want him to leave. And maybe that's why that the transfer was quite protracted. Maybe they just weren't keen on the player to go, on the player going, and because they know his value and his worth at Aston Villa. So if he's been given the number 9 shirt, then maybe that chance of maybe getting him as on a loan to buy deal could be fading away. And then, of course, there's more rumour going on about Tammy Abraham leaving Roma in Italy to come to West Ham United if we make a bid of £25 million. Now, I don't know. I'm not sold on this one, to be quite honest with you. Would we want another striker? I am convinced that if we do our business, it's going to be another defender and potentially another striker. But when you look at what's happening in midfield, one can't help feeling that it may not be just 2 players coming in. It could be potentially 3. And if you go back to the squad, these are the areas that I believe. It's a 25-man squad. As I said the other day, Guilherme doesn't have to be named in the squad because he's a player who's under 21. Doesn't mean he won't play in the senior, won't play with the senior squad. He will, but he doesn't have to be named. But the 3 players that, as I've said, I think have got a big question mark over them are Zuma, Cornet, and Ings. And I think if there's one more bit of business to do, or if there's a final bit of transfer business to do, then it will be in those 3 areas. I can still see all 3 players potentially leaving before the end of this summer transfer window, and potentially us getting 3 players in to replace them. Join me again for another update once we get it. Quite a lot of information for you guys to take in, but great news on the whole concession tickets. Still a way to go. And let's see what happens in the final few weeks, shall we? It's going to be interesting to see what other business we do. Have a good day, and I'll see you all very soon.